This is Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative. This season, we're partnering with Democracy xChange, Canada's Democracy Summit, taking place April 16th to 18th in downtown Toronto. The summit tackles today's most urgent civic issues over 3 days of programming, including inspiring speakers, thought-provoking expert panels, and hands-on workshops. As a Progress Canada listener, you can save 20% off registration by using this code, Lightbulb at DXC26. Visit democracyxchange.org to register today. Today we're joined by Victoria Kuketz, public policy professional, Obama Foundation scholar, and advisory committee member for the 2026 Democracy xChange Conference. Thanks so much for joining me.
Oh my gosh, what a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
I think we're going to have a great conversation today. So, we've been doing pre-roll this whole season so far about the Democracy xChange Conference. So I went for the first time last year, had a great time. It was very inspiring. I felt really good about politics, which is not something that always happens, of course. But it's nice to be in a room of people who care about the same things and want to improve the places that you live in. So I suspect you feel the same because, of course, you're on the program advisory committee for the conference. The conference is coming up in Toronto in April. What is the conference all about, and why should people attend?
I'm so glad you were there last year, and I hope you got to stay for the sing-along at the end because that was truly one of the most special parts.
I did, and it was really, really nice, actually.
I know people were crying of happiness and connection, and that's the point, right? So we're so happy to come back a year later and present the 7th edition of Democracy xChange. I've been there since the first year, so I'm really so proud to be able to watch it evolve in its journey. And I think to really break it down, the conference really aims to bring Canada into the room across all sectors and set right at Toronto Metropolitan University. What I mean by that is that we bring together students, civil society, public service, policymakers, concerned parents, 16 and 17-year-olds who are getting close to voting age. And also, what's been really interesting is an increasingly international presence as well. And together, we try to take on both the realities of democracy in the present and all of its challenges, as well as what we're pushing for and safeguarding in the future as well. So what people can expect is quite riveting keynotes. I'll talk about the speakers a little bit later on, but it's pretty exciting. But then, democracy isn't just about listening. That's an important part of it, but we also need to get our hands dirty, right? So there'll be hands-on workshops, there'll be really engaging panels, and there'll be topics that really speak to every element of this conversation. And so what I really want people to know is that this conference, it's really responsive, it's hard-hitting, and most importantly, it's welcoming people at all interest and knowledge levels. I don't want people feeling like, I'm interested in democracy, but do I really know how to hold this conversation? Can I really see myself there? Yes. And the most important questions, I think, come from people who are newer to the conversation, who have something new to offer and bring that new voice. So it's an invitation to deep dive with the rest of us.
One of the things I've learned from my life in politics is that people think it's very gate kept and that you can't get involved as just a random person. They think you have to come from some political dynasty or whatever the case may be. And part of that is people not knowing how to access these spaces. And I think that's part of why this conference is so important, because it's just right there. Register. It's a really good fee price because sometimes these things are expensive too. This is a well-priced event, and there are measures in place, of course, to help people who maybe need a bit more economic assistance with attending. So that's important. But it's also what you were saying, where it's a whole swath of different people. I remember at lunch last year, I was sort of holding court in a random corner, and I had old friends that I had worked with walk up. I had new people that I had just met walked up. I had a former premier walk up. There's all kinds of people at this event that you can just get to know and engage with and build lasting relationships with to actually help make progress going forward. So it's just a lovely space to be in on a personal level. And then, of course, there are the things that you learn about through the sessions and the programming. So I want to talk about that because each year, like any other conference, there's a different conference theme. This year, I was pretty excited about the theme specifically because I've been talking a lot about, our economic situation as, a country, a world at this point. And there's a little bit of a focus on that this year. Can you talk a bit about the conference theme and why that was so important to tackle this year as sort of the big problem that we want to talk about this weekend.
Absolutely. So I think the leadership between OCAD University, the dais at Toronto Metropolitan University, and the Open Democracy Project have really determined an important conference theme. And it's side by side, building an economy that serves democracy. I actually want to let that linger in the air for a moment because this is such an undertold story, but a critical connecting point. So together at the conference, we're going to explore how people shape democratic and economic systems together. I know that sounds really complex, but I think it's an important conversation for us all to engage in. And I want to break it down a little bit, and I'd love your help in that too. So I think what I'd start out by saying is that we know that a healthy and functioning democracy is the foundation for a strong economy and vice versa. These things are totally interconnected and mutually reinforcing. A strong economy that does not suffer from too much inequality has the conditions for a strong democracy. The less inequality, the less extreme politics exist, in my opinion. And not to mention the rule of law, right? The economy needs the rule of law in order for markets to perform strongly, and democracy helps ensure that. I think there's a couple other important points here as well, which really help determine that theme. We're in a serious moment of democratic recession. A whopping 72% of the world operates under authoritarian rule. This is really serious, and we're seeing further decline in other strongholds in the West as well. In my role as an Obama Foundation Scholar at Columbia University this year, I've had the privilege of studying with Maria Ressa, and she repeatedly cautions. We're in the last. I know.
I love her. Sorry.
She's absolutely the best.
I completely agree. But incredible. Yes.
Yes. And, every day we have these conversations, and her repeated refrain is, we're in the last 2 minutes of democracy. And I think that this is something that we can all understand, but I also think we have a visceral reaction to, right? Like it's at that endpoint almost. So all of this is a call to action for us to do everything we can, all the citizen engagement, all the policy advocacy, all the community building, and anything in our power to protect it. So going back to the economy for a second, is that democracy needs investment, right? And not just from a citizen level, but we know that markets operate best under democracy as well. I learned recently from a Columbia Business School professor named Marcos Buscaglia that there's a strong correlation between investment suitability and stable democracies. So interesting, right? He shared a paper from academics named Lee and Wisniewski that finds a positive relationship between democracy and equity returns. So democracy grows faster than non-democracies. And my final thought on this piece, because I think it's important, is that Canadian democracy needs investment. We are a bright star for the rest of the world. And for far too long, I would actually say that democracy and democratic engagement work has been overlooked in sustainability portfolios across grantors in our entire country, except for the foundations and government, quite frankly. So it's really time to look at the data and mitigate democratic risk with strong investment in the entire democratic ecosystem in Canada.
I think it's a really good point, and I've been really interested in this concept of a democracy recession because, in my own life, I am a millennial. I just turned 40 on the weekend. So
congratulations!
Thank you. I'm getting older and older. But, even in my early 20s, of course, I graduated in the spring of 2008, directly into that recession, the Great Recession, the greatest one since the Great Depression. And, I think my generation has really been set back ever since then. It is really hard to economically recover when you have been set back by something like that. And I've also seen simultaneously beside that, this lesser interest in democracy, if you will, this democracy recession, because people have seen that, well, maybe democracy is not working out for me or my generation. So why should I support it? Why should I be involved? Why should I be interested at all? And there's a real danger in that. Like, I'm in this country. On the one side, it's Portuguese. The other side is Polish. We're in Canada because, my grandparents were in countries that did not have democracy anymore, that had been taken over by fascist elements. And there's a real danger that when democracy doesn't deliver for people economically, that people turn away from it and they'd rather just burn everything down and turn towards fascism. And to your point, like, we're in a real danger of that happening in a lot of Western democracies now because people are really, really struggling. So I think the topic is really well placed in time because this is something that I've been concerned about for, I don't know, 15 to 20 years at this point. And it seems to be, I feel like we've started maybe to come back from the brink because we've seen some really poor examples happening in some major countries around the world that had been bastions of democracy. And, you take a look at the United States. I look back at FDR and how it was very close back then before he got elected. Like, there was a tipping point that could have happened. Nazis marched at downtown New York, where you are right now, right? There is a history of countries being really important democracies, but also on the precipice of falling into that kind of fascism and totalitarianism. So there's a real risk. And part of climbing out of that and avoiding that is participation. So I think, this is a great point to start. Come to the convention. We've got a discount code for you, so please use that. But I think this is a really important time to be talking about these issues in the first place. So I want to talk about some of the programming, though, because what is really cool about this conference, what is really cool about this conference is it's not just keynote speakers, it's not just breakout rooms. There's also democracy workshops, which I think is a really, really cool element. So there's two opportunities this year at the conference. One is the Emerging Leaders Workshop, which is focused obviously on young people. And the other one is the Democracy Futures Workshop, which you're going to have to tell me more about this because even just the title of it makes me very interested. But they're going to be crafting a civic sovereignty charter for 2035. What's that all about? What are these sessions like? What will people experience when they go to them?
Doesn't a civic sovereignty charter just sound so cool?
It really, really does. Like, I read it and I'm like, I don't even know what that is, but I want to know more.
Okay, so I'm going to unpack it a little bit. So the workshop piece, as I mentioned before, is a really integral part of Democracy xChange because it offers that chance for people to be really hands-on and do the work of democracy, so to speak. It's one thing to listen, it's another thing to be part of it and to be co-creating. And this has been a huge value of Democracy xChange since the beginning. And when I tell you that the workshop is a whopping 5 hours long, I think that really shows that investment in co-creation and doing deep work. Because it's only with deep work that we can move the needle, right? So as you mentioned, there are two workshops. The first one is Unbound, Canada's Sovereignty and Democracy Futures. What we know is that Canadian sovereignty is the top of everyone's concerns right now, and that our country is facing unprecedented challenge in this area. So the question is, what's actually possible to do and to safeguard it? And how do we get this out of closed public policy rooms and really elite offices and bring it into not just public conversation, but public strategy, right? So the workshop is going to actually leverage strategic foresight, which is a way of looking ahead to understand, the forces that shape the future so we can make better decisions in the present. And rather than trying to predict what will actually happen, it helps leaders think through emerging trends, risks, and possibilities so they're not caught reacting to change after the fact. I think many of us are guilty of doing that, right? So this is a different way of thinking. It's a more strategic way. So at its core, it's about building that capacity to anticipate and navigate uncertainty rather than trying to respond to it. So it's in that vein that small groups will come together through a series of activities to uncover different insights, connections, implications, and opportunities for the future of Canadian sovereignty and democracy. So with that, they'll come back together in plenary to craft this Canadian sovereignty charter to craft a Canadian sovereignty charter for 2035. So, if there's still room in the workshop, I urge you to sign up because I think this is an important thing. We're all wondering what's actually possible, what's really at risk, and what can we do about it. The second workshop is called Making the Future. And I'm really excited about this one because it's entirely focused on Canadian youth and emerging leaders. What we know is that they're the inheritor and stewards of our democracy. So this is a really conscious investment to center them, to really learn how they're taking leadership across issues like the affordability crisis, digital disruption, and all the other things that we're faced with, while also supporting and centering their leadership, giving them mentorship and additional capabilities, passing the microphone to them so that they can teach all of us about what's necessary and how they're meeting the moment in these times.
For those who might miss out on it because they're busy that day or they didn't sneak into the registration in time for it, will the results of these discussions be published in any way, made public in any way? How can people find out about, what went down in these sessions?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that Democracy xChange has done really well is release position papers or policy memos or blogs after the fact. And you can certainly write into the conference organizers if you're not able to find those or access them, and we can certainly send them to you.
Awesome. Yeah, I think I had seen a few things online from past years, and I was like, this is, again, just a wonderful organization.
They really are.
Well, this is part of the thing, right? Like, you do all this work and you don't want it to just disappear into the ether. So I think it's really important to have these things be accessible. Speaking of access, I want to talk about thought leadership in this conference, because I think, having attended last year and knowing the registration fee and the various ways that the conference makes sure everybody can attend, I think it's a really, really cool event for democratizing access to thought leadership. So
Yes.
Not that long ago, we had Davos, and we have all these people who show up to Davos every year, and, there's these cliquey rooms, and it's very closed to the rest of the world. We may get to see the speeches streamed, as, one of them was very famously streamed from a certain Canadian Prime Minister this year. But for the most part, your average Canadian citizen who cares about democracy and wants to be involved doesn't get access to those kind of thought leaders. Not the case with this conference. So there's a number of addresses, feature speakers who will show up at this event. And, this year we've got a Nobel laureate, an ambassador. There's a number of leading authors in the democracy space. So some really heavy hitters who are great to hear from. Last year, the reason I signed up, other than, other friends were going and things like that, Timothy Snyder was there last year, and I really wanted to hear him speak because I've been following him for years. He's obviously blown up quite a bit in the last couple of years, what's going on in the US. But really, really great thought leaders who have a lot to share about what we could be doing differently. Can you talk about some of the featured speakers this year and what they'll be talking about?
Yes, absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right. If we're going to say it plainly, this conference lineup with many other organizations would have cost like $1,000 a ticket. And that would have been table stakes for many organizations. But that also would have meant that Canada's community would have been left out yet again. And so what's really amazing about Democracy xChange is that it breaks down those barriers and builds community. The ticket price is something like, an inexpensive lunch. And there, again, is that pathway as well, if you're experiencing economic barriers, to be able to write in and say, can I please have a ticket? Here are my circumstances. Or even better, and where I started at Democracy xChange 7 years ago, was as a grad student who offered to volunteer. And, they very warmly took me in, and here I am 7 years later, right? So they create their own pipeline.
And I remember last year too, there was the option, I don't know if there is this year as well. If there is, people should do it. I remember last year I got my ticket, and then I was able to comp a ticket for a student as well.
Yes.
So that's always a nice option too, is being able to pay it forward, if you will, because, I'm sure people did that when I was young, and probably when you were young as well. So it's always nice to be able to help people out.
Well, thank you for doing that for another student. And yes, there's all these different pathways. So I really encourage people to take a look at them. But with that in mind, back to the thought leadership question. Oh my gosh, the speakers list is really extraordinary. It's everybody out in the world fighting for democracy, for human rights, and are really at the forefront of the innovation economy, AI, and other frontier science that's really rapidly changing and shaping our entire world. So I'd love to give you a very quick rundown of some of the ones that I'm most excited about. But we have Canadian author and journalist Cory, Doctorow, who recently released Enshitification, everybody's favorite word to say, why everything got worse and what to do about it. And he really unpacks the process where digital platforms start by serving users well, and then gradually degrade that experience as they prioritize extracting value for advertisers, for shareholders, and then eventually over the needs of the people who use them. So it's really about the quality experience of digital and how we're losing it. So I'm really excited to hear him speak about that. And then another mind-blowing person that they're bringing to the stage is Nobel laureate Daron Acemoglu, who has written so many books, but I think maybe the one I'll overview is Why Nations Fail: Power, Prosperity, and Poverty. So he really, is such an incredible subject matter expert of political economy, and he really discusses that economic success is driven by inclusive political and economic institutions. And that's really what we're here to talk about at Democracy Exchange. So he really unpacks those historical decisions that have shaped power so that we understand them in our world. And I think knowing the history is a huge piece of understanding how we got here and where we go. And then I'm very proud to share that I'm bringing home one of my fellow Obama Foundation scholars, Valeria Kovtun of Ukraine, who has worked on media literacy and is considered one of the leading minds in cognitive warfare and mis and disinformation. She worked on behalf of the Ukrainian government. She worked in big tech called Open Minds, and she's really brilliant. And we're going to be doing a workshop basically on what those who are fighting against authoritarian rule can teach Canadians in this moment. I think it's a really important conversation. And I wanted to do that because I always said, if this Obama Scholar Foundation opportunity was only good for me, that would be a terrible thing. And so this is my way of bringing back some of the lessons and learnings to Canada. And then just the last one I'll plug too, because it's led by two extraordinary leaders that I have really been inspired by over my career. We have Ilse Trunicht and Zita Cobb, and they are the keynote that give the conference its name. So they're going to be leading side by side, building the economy from place, people, and purpose. So they're really going to talk about economies should be collective choices designed side by side with communities. And so they're going to draw on their experiences in the innovation economy and politics, et cetera. So they're really going to outline what it builds an economy, what it takes to build an economy that actually genuinely serves democracy from the ground up. And I think this is a conversation people need to hear.
Very, very excited about those. I'm also very excited about some of the breakout sessions because it's always kind of nice to be in a smaller room, get to be close up with a panel and, ask questions and really get into a discussion over a period of time. Not that I don't love the big hall as well. That's always fun too. But one of the sessions that, like anytime I go to a conference, I'm always like, okay, what am I going to go to? What am I most interested in? And when I was scanning the list, there's a lot of great sessions, but there was one specifically on human rights in the digital age, which is something I'm really concerned about because I think AI can be a useful tool. A lot of our digitization can be really, really useful, but there's also perhaps some dangers with it and perhaps some curbing of human rights. This AI by default is perhaps maybe not how I should be going. So there's a lot of conversations to be had about this, which is why I'm glad that the conference is focusing so much in this space. You've got a lot of background in this, of course. So you have done some work with Mila, which is the Quebec Artificial Intelligence Institute, which A, it's great that we have something like that in Canada, and B, I'm really glad we have you today to talk a little bit more about it. But the goal of that organization, of course, is to make AI benefit everyone. And I'm sort of in that kind of space as well, where I think this is something that is going to happen. Technology progresses. So how can we make it useful for people? So I wanted to ask you, in the vein of playing off that session, from your perspective, how can we make sure that AI technology is used to help people participate in democracy rather than help undercut democracy?
Oh, this is a hard question, especially as we see the guardrails come off more and more in the United States and a different kind of AI emerging. I really want to acknowledge the harm we're seeing, and it feels like ethical AI is taking a hit in a really fundamental way. But the truth is, I feel more encouraged, and I think this community of practitioners, academics, public servants, we feel more encouraged than ever to make sure that as AI shapes democracy, and it already is, the question is, how can we make it so that we can be more intentional about designing it in ways that can strengthen democratic participation rather than continuing to erode trust? So I want to be careful about my words here because we're seeing the erosion of trust. We're seeing the harm. We're seeing this proliferation of, black box engineering and all these things. But where I get hope is precisely what you said. Through my engagement with Mila, the Quebec Artificial Intelligence Institute, I was able to take the AI and Human Rights Summer School, which brought together 40 practitioners from around the world, data scientists, computer engineers, lawyers in human rights, and myself as a public policy expert, and just bringing together this interdisciplinary global cohort to really talk about how do we maintain human rights, how do we build things, how do we build connective tissue, and what do we need to be thinking about? And so this is where I really feel encouraged. So I learned, and I think this conference will learn in this conversation, how are systems built? what values are embedded into them, and who gets to shape those decisions. Because it's actually not a technical conversation, which is why so many people count themselves out of it. It's actually very much a human rights, a social sciences, and humanities conversation. And I want to really ground that in our understanding. So if we want AI to support democracy, transparency, accountability, human rights, all the things that we are desperate to see, we all have to be part of that design process, right? Not just from the beginning, but as problems emerge. So I want to give one quick example. I actually got to ask President Obama this question back in December. And I said, as a democracy practitioner, as we see, trust and harm proliferate rather than, AI serve democracy, should I be preaching abstinence, or should I be doubling down on AI literacy and democratizing the technology? And I have to admit, my hands were shaking because I was like, I'm really putting myself out there, and I don't know what people are going to say or going to think, but these are the conversations in the rooms that I'm in. And so the president looked at me and he said, if your parents had chosen not to adopt the internet 20 years ago, where would we be in terms of their slice of the economic pie, in terms of the digital divide? AI is here to stay, but we need actually strong governance. We need people in those kinds of roles who can translate complex policy, who can make civic engagement more accessible. And he said, your role as someone who builds, rooms and opportunities to help create AI literacy and adoption, that's important work. And no one will ever criticize you for doing that. So I think the question is, how can we as civil society in the democratic space make sure that AI helps more people, engages more of us, and helps shape, and that we can all help shape the decisions around AI that will govern our lives?
It's so funny because I saw a panel on TV the other day, I think it was CBC, and they were saying it was about the Australian ban on kids under 16 using the internet. And the panelists were saying, oh, we haven't really talked about this in Canada. And not true. There's a lot of conversation about it. Andre, who is from the organizations that's putting on this event, Andre Cote, we had him on earlier last season to talk about digital harms. And we were talking about, well, is abstinence really the solution? Because of course we have a mountain of data from, teaching sex ed that suggests perhaps it's not. And we also know that this is sort of where the technology is going. So how can we, get people using these things in a way that's really, really safe? So the thing that has come up a lot, obviously, in the democracy space when it comes to technology is disinformation, digital harassment, online scams, cyber threats. Like the number of phone scams now that are using like AI and like voice cloning and all this kind of stuff. There's a lot out there now. And it's governments tend to be behind the eight ball in keeping up with these things. But I think blanket abstinence policies don't actually train people how to recognize these things. And I think, I'm a big fan of the Finland model, where you actually teach people how to recognize disinformation and digital harms, and then they are able to recognize it anytime they see it and navigate it accordingly. I guess it comes to the question of, there are some who I guess at this point think the internet is inherently bad for people in democracy. But I think I'm more of the viewpoint that we aren't building digital spaces as safely as we could, and we are creating them in a way that rewards, conflict and harm instead of conversation and progress. How do we get more to that second side of the ledger, as opposed to sort of where we are now, where perhaps that ethical lens isn't getting enough of a focus?
I think this is the question of the century, and it's so interesting to see things unfold in Australia and like the large youth backlash that's happening as well. So I think, as we try and test out different public policy levers, we'll get there. But what I'll say at first is, I don't think the internet is inherently bad for people or for democracy. I think what we're really seeing is the result of systems and incentives we've built into digital spaces. And that's what we have to contend with, right? And I think you rightly said that before as well. So as we know, so many of the platforms are designed to reward attention, speed, engagement, division, all these different things. We know that conflict and outrage travel faster than nuance or deliberation. But inspiration trumps conflict and outrage. So I also think, these things, while they seem insurmountable, they're not. But when those incentives shape the architecture of our digital public square, it does amplify all the worst of it. But it's not the technology itself, right? It's how we choose to design and govern it. And I'm going to say that probably 100 times in this conversation. We need better governance. And I think, people over at Taylor Owen and team at Media Technology Democracy have been doing some really great work on that. And I want to refer your listeners over to their policy papers. But I think what we have to do is really start to leverage and do more public education, quality public education around digital tools that are expanding access to information, connecting communities across borders, ensuring that there is no more digital divide, which continues to persist in Canada, which is unbelievable, and lower those barriers to civic participation. I think also we need to think of ourselves as builders. What we know is that Canada has a productivity gap. And I think that a lot of us would rather see ourselves as not technical, or maybe the policy avenue of all of this is a little bit more inviting. But I think for us to build the internet that we want, the democracy we want, the communities we want, we have to roll up our sleeves. So I think, what does it actually take to have the mindset of an innovator? What does it take to learn some of these skills? You can build some pathways or digital engagement tools or algorithms, quite frankly, that you want to see and work with. And what does it mean to actually train up your community as well, so that people are coming along with you rather than being left behind? So I think all that to say, better platform design, stronger accountability, broader collaboration between technologists, policymakers, civil society, and we need to just make sure that these digital environments reflect our democratic values rather than undermine them. But I will say, there's disproportionate power relations right now. And the big question is, how do we contend with those? I don't have the answers, but I'm looking forward to seeing what, the 700 of us who get together for Democracy xChange can come up with.
I really like what you're saying about people getting involved in the process and not seeing themselves as, well, I'm not technical. I'm not, the one in the background designing these things and doing the coding and all that. So therefore I have no role in this. I don't know if you follow her, but there's a PhD student out from Harvard named Shay O who spends a lot of time talking about AI. And because her background is in the humanities, I'm a philosophy grad.
Amazing.
I'm similar to her, where I think, people have always said my philosophy degree is useless, but I have found it one of the most useful pieces of education you can get, because it's teaching you critical thinking, it's teaching you ethics. There's all these different elements that are just skills that you use every day that don't go out of fashion, do not go out of use. And that's part of why the humanities are so important. And what Shay O argues is that you have these AI platforms that are gobbling up all of the content that humans have created over history, right? But at a certain point, they will run out of content to do that, which is why you still need humanities students, because you need people creating new content for them to learn off of. And it really does speak to your point about, we all have a role to play. We all have a use in this process. And the AI revolution, just like the internet revolution, just like computers before that, just like any technological revolution we've had, doesn't have to obliterate human purpose. And I think trying to keep that in mind is really, really important, because, I worked on the basic income pilot in Ontario. I've been thinking about AI and technology as something that would come for jobs eventually. So we have to think about, people need meaning, people need purpose in their lives, and how do we get that? It may be from work, it may be from other sources, but I think all of these conversations are sort of wrapped up in each other. And I think your point about making sure that people are actually involved in these conversations and don't just sort of shut down as soon as they hear AI being talked about, I think that's really important. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
But it's scary, right? Like, it's scary to go in knowing that you know nothing and that it's going to be hard contributing to the conversation. So I will also share, I'm a 2-time arts and humanities grad too. So congratulations on your philosophy degree. I have an undergrad and a master's in literature, and specifically poetry, from U of T. And so I think we are and I would say, like, not just you and I think this, I would also say the two co-CEOs at Anthropic think this too, who have recently said that arts and humanities grads are really important. And I think this has been a very important cultural contribution, because studying these things were the butt of jokes for a really long time. And now we're seeing the reality is that we're cultural producers. We think critically. We do all these things that are actually important when it comes to defending democracy, when it comes to, understanding, like, these black box algorithm, critiquing them, and essentially dreaming the future as well. That is literally what, philosophers and writers and all these people do. So all that to say, I went into that Mila summer school, I think being the only arts and humanities grad in the entire room. I had major imposter syndrome. But you know what? I actually had a huge role to play when it came to the human rights side of things, when we discussed like digital colonialism, when we talked about, harm and affect across the world. And so the thing is, we all have a role to play, and we need to do like knowledge exchange as well. I taught people what I knew, and they taught me basic tenets of like technical pieces when it came to building AI. So I would say like lean in that regard, and like let's become a culture of builders.
The other thing I would say too is if you haven't gone through someone's educational path, like you don't really know what was on it. Like for me, I did a specialization in philosophy, which is like a super major, and then I had a minor in sociology, and I had a bunch of different courses that I was interested in. I almost minored in music and things like that, but I just had a lot of interest. But at the end of the day, I was trying to avoid doing more math in my life.
Me too.
I didn't want to take psych to avoid it. But then, wouldn't you know, philosophy has a mandatory component, at least at the U of O, where they teach both analytic and continental philosophy. You had to
get away from it.
You had to take symbolic logic, which is translating like theories, and there's all these just it's symbols. Like it's basically math. Like I've always said that, biology becomes chemistry, chemistry becomes physics, physics becomes math, and math becomes philosophy as you get higher up in the grades and onto post-secondary. So you can't escape it. And I think that's what people don't understand about a lot of these humanities paths. Like there's actually a lot going on there that perhaps they don't know about. I do want to talk about this involvement piece some more, because I think everything you just said really dovetails nicely with one of the sessions, which is democracy as a team sport, which I just love as a concept. I used to play competitive sports as a kid. I was on a rep softball team. So I have always thought politics and democracy is very much suited for people who want like adrenaline and to hang out with other people and come together to achieve something together. So there is a session on that at this event. And I do think it's maybe a concept we've lost in recent years. We have a lot of polarization happening in Canada and around the world now. And in one of your 18,000 hats that you wear, you're also a fellow over at Public Policy Forum, and you worked on a project about rising polarization in the country. Why have we stopped seeing people on the other side of the political spectrum as our partners in democracy, our teammates?
This is a really great and hard question. And maybe I'll start in the present and then go back to my work a little bit. So the Edelman 2026 Trust Barometer calls this moment the crisis of insularity, right? And so that undermines the idea of a team sport to begin with. It talks about the fact that we're much more comfortable in our close-knit communities with people who think, talk, act, potentially look like us as well. And I don't think we're surprised to hear this news, but to hear that be labeled the crisis of our time is particularly distressing. What I will say, though, where this conference is set and our country, at large, tells a bit of a different story. Canada is actually built on diversity. Canada is built on neighborhoods of people from around the world. You can't actually take the TTC without hearing 14 or 15 different languages. And so I think, how can our city and how can our country be, not to be corny, but be a bit of a beacon in the crisis of insularity? Because life in Toronto is just not that. So I want to say that I love the idea of this session as democracy being a team sport, because it's very possible. Many of us live it and model it every day. And that's one of the reasons why I took on architecting and scaling what's considered now to be the most systemic diagnostic on polarization to date on behalf of the Public Policy Forum. It was called Far and Widening the Rise of Polarization in Canada. And Justin Ling, who's one of the greatest investigative journalists, worked alongside me to write the report. I think we saw a few things come out of that. So number one, some of the learnings were that people didn't really feel like any of the conversations or any of the choices available to them really expressed the realities. And I'll give you a couple different examples. Number one, a lot of young people that we spoke to didn't understand the left-right binary, so opted out of politics altogether. They're opting out of our team sport of the political system in our country. They felt that there was no meaningful engagement with politicians or that they were actually being listened to. And I think this points to a larger experience of exclusionary democracy in Canada. There's a lot of great people in the space who write about civic space being inaccessible, being foreboding. And so what does it mean when public spaces make you feel like you don't belong? Do you want to engage in that team sport? I think one of the ways we tried to work against this was the way that we actually scaled that project. We put young people at the center of it. We spoke to 1,600 people, 1,600 young people between 18 to 35 across 321 locations in Canada. And we had them center this whole conversation on polarization. Then we took it up to a research layer where we worked with the Center for Media, Technology, and Democracy and had researchers across the country in different regions tell the story of polarization. Then we took it to the political level and sat with, sitting politicians, journalists. We had an advisory that had representation from an Indigenous chief in this country. We had, as broad a spectrum of Canadians as we could possibly do, because we wanted to show that without that team sport mentality, we actually couldn't get anywhere. And so all that to say, we have to stop thinking that we can actually do anything without the other side, right? The other side is not an enemy. The other side is a fellow citizen or community member. And when we reject that other side, as difficult as it might be, that's when we've given up our sense of shared responsibility. That's when democracy weakens. And that's when the idea of it as a team sport starts to break down. And I really want to commend our Prime Minister, who I think has been modeling what democracy as a team sport is really all about. And so how can we take up that call to action ourselves? And that's why you should all come to this workshop and hear from these brilliant people who are putting it on.
I think about inclusion a lot, just as somebody who cares about it.
Yes.
But, I think historically, there's a lot of ways that people can feel disincluded in our political process. So, as we've seen human rights progress, we also see backlash to that, and there's some inclusion that gets lost because of that. And I think also, though, the theme of the conference about it being focused on economics, there's an economic inclusion piece too, where I think a lot of people feel left out of the prosperity of the country. Like, we are a very rich country, and yet a lot of people's experience is not that. Is the best way going forward to keep, team democracy intact, to find ways to include people in all the diversity that they feel excluded right now?
Yeah, and this is a really tough question. I'm glad you asked me, because my former role prior to coming to the Obama Foundation was actually as a director of corporate engagement and advisor on inclusion for Canada's major corporations. And we went through this crisis last year, quite frankly, when President Trump got elected, and all of a sudden, inclusion was an illegal word, and the work was experiencing a historic backlash like we'd never seen before. I want to be careful and say, the work of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, I hold in the highest regard. And it is so important to democracy. It is a team sport. What I will say as a professional who's worked in the space for a long time is that I'm not sure the work and that industry itself was living up to that promise. As we saw an affordability gap, as we saw a men's mental health crisis explode and the level of suicidation explode, the industry was quite slow to meet it. And I think people looked at it and said, well, what about my pain? And started to resent these processes. And we have to maybe take it out of the industry and zoom out to Canada at large. But I think that message still coheres. So I think the point is, in this moment, how can we look at economic inclusion and all the different layers of barriers that people are facing and really meet that head on? I'll give you one great example of an organization that I worked with that I think did something quite brilliant. Green Shield, which is a health insurance company in Canada, has historically done, a few free mental health sessions for people who are experiencing disproportionate barriers. In the pandemic, it was, women who were disproportionately laid off, but also caregivers and other pieces. And now they've done this social impact initiative where they're offering 2 free therapy sessions to any Canadian who's experiencing economic anxiety around the tariffs. And I just think this is such a brilliant way to engage Team Canada, see people's pain, and to be able to act on it in a way that feels really responsive. So I think that's a very long-winded answer for your question about this team sport and the notion of inclusion. I think the thing is that none of us are going to have consensus all the time, but inclusion is what makes it feel possible, you know? So in a healthy democracy, people certainly do not need to agree on anything. In fact, quite the opposite. But they do need to feel that the system or the team or that the country sees them, hears them, and gives them a meaningful way to participate.
This was actually a conversation I had with Kathleen Wynne, the former Premier of Ontario, at the convention last year. At the conference, we were chatting about a third person we were with had brought up how she was always willing to listen to people, even if they didn't agree with her. She wanted to hear them out. She was interested in their perspective. She was curious about it, which I think curiosity is one of the most important skills you have, because it does, rather than being angry or affronted or whatever about something someone has said or their perspective or how they feel, you get interested in it instead and try and figure out why they feel that way and perhaps how you can address those issues. And I think it's an important quality of leadership. I think it's also an important quality of anyone participating in a democracy. And I think it does also help address some of the disconnect that people feel. So again, you do 12 million things in your day-to-day, and one of them is democracy dialogues at TMU, at the Democratic Engagement Exchange. And in those conversations, you talk a lot about why people feel disconnected from the political process. What are some of those reasons that people have given?
This is a great question. The thing about democracy dialogues is that it really centers citizens, grassroots community leaders who are actually up against a lot, right? So what we hear from them and what we hear in general is community leaders, like, for example, a youth manager at the YMCA is frontline to all the issues that we're facing, right? So it's frontline to the isolation crisis that Toronto went through, and I think continues to go through after the pandemic. Is frontline to food scarcity. Is frontline to transportation disruption. Is frontline to family dynamics and all the different things that people carry when they go into these spaces. And we know that young people are hurting, and we know that society at large is hurting too. So that, coupled with the issues that feel more quote unquote classic democracy, not feeling like your voice is heard and you can't meaningfully shape outcomes, is a big reason why people feel so disconnected. So when people don't see themselves reflected or listened to in political institutions, they feel that the decisions that are being made feel distant or highly partisan, or that they can't cut through the noise or see like legitimate advancement on policy issues because of political theater, of infighting. Those don't seem to be in the interest of people in community. And so that's why we created Democracy Dialogues. And, I want to give a shout out to John Beebe, who initially created the series and then gave it to me to host. But the whole point of it is to bring communities into conversation and listen to them, to find out what they need, and then to be responsive with our programming. And I'll give you a couple different examples of this. So number one, we heard that access to professional development was really difficult and quite low in terms of budget for people who are community leaders. So much like Democracy Exchange, we try to bring in the speakers, the thinkers, the doers that are often in rooms that cost, again, like $1,000 a ticket, and bring them to community and to be in conversation with them. We brought conversations 2 or 3 years ago on responsible AI and democracy, on all the kind of different emerging pieces that are happening. I'm looking forward to doing one about democracy and our digital twin, which is another emergent piece where citizens eventually, it looks like, will be able to send a digital twin as a proxy to government spaces to be able to advocate for them. But oh my gosh, what are the implications of that? Do we trust that? Do we want that? And so I think it's important for citizens to have a space where they're listened to, where they're centered, and where it can be actually constructive. We don't actually always agree in these dialogues at all, but I will say that in all of our post-session surveys and amongst the guests, people actually feel heard, respected, and they feel that they can contribute in a way that doesn't get them canceled or misunderstood or, unable to like fully lean in.
I think we've done a really good job. I mean, our voter turnout wouldn't suggest always, but I think we've done a pretty good job of convincing people that going to the ballot box is a very important way to express their political will and their democratic intentions. But That's not the only way. The way I've always looked at it, having been involved in politics, I'm doing I'm doing democracy in between election cycles all the time. But for most people, they think, okay, I'm just going to go to the voting booth. Some of them haven't even made up their decision till they get there, which I think is wild. But they go to the voting booth, they put their ballot in, and then they're like, okay, done until the next time. Which I think is a bit of a disservice to the public in how we frame democracy in this country, because ultimately, there are a lot of ways that people can be democratically active in between elections. You can go to protests, you can write letters. There's also a lot of perhaps less activisty ways to participate as well. There are many, many ways to participate. What are some of the ones that you've seen people talk about and maybe have some success?
I really love this question because, election day is important. Let's be serious. It's the culmination of all the things that we do as a society that get us there. But democracy is every single way a continuous practice. And I want to use maybe two really intentional words about how we can think about who we are and what we might be doing throughout the year and around elections. And that's being a neighbor and being a community member and citizen. So there's so many different things you can do. You can join community conversations around public issues. So when you get those notes in your mailbox, not just throwing them away, but going to public consultations. You can contribute to citizens' assemblies, policy consultations. You can be a good volunteer. I think Canada, the most recent data I saw, we have a crisis of volunteerism in our country.
We do.
So how can you get yourself out of your home and away from your screen, which, really and truly is not making you happy, and get out among community members, be in service of something greater than yourself and help where there's need. I think this is the most important one. I think the other question is, how can you do something really small, invite people over for dinner and facilitate discussions that help you think through issues or allow you to engage in some, a bit of good trouble, a little bit of argument, and figure out how you might feel on an issue by listening to other people. So I think it can run an entire spectrum. And if you're the type who is maybe I want to acknowledge the amount of social burnout people also have from the workplace and from this interconnected world, you can also go clean up your park or volunteer at a senior's home or do the things that make you feel interconnected, part of and an unforgettable part of your community. And I think this is actually what democracy in practice looks like. It can be very small, it can be grassroots, but if you're in service of, neighbor, being a great neighbor, being a great citizen, being a great friend, being a community member, and seeing the issues just outside your doorstep as not just someone else's to fix, but your own as well, then I think this is the work, right? This is what will actually build trust, bridge differences, and keep that civic fabric healthy and alive.
I really like the example of the dinner because I saw someone online, basically as their project for 2025, they decided every Friday they were going to invite a different group of people over every week. They were going to cook them dinner and they were just going to talk about society and what was going on. And that was their democratic act for the year, which I thought was really interesting and creative and unexpected and not what people think. But to your point, it doesn't have to be a big thing. We are in a crisis of food security right now. We have over 4 million people in this country visiting food banks, and, dropping off a bag of groceries at your local food bank is an important way to be part of your democracy. It's not always the ways that people think. One of the ways that I know in my neighborhood is we have a number of different parks going up because on my block alone, there's 9 different buildings going up and we have a lot of people moving into the neighborhood, which is great. It's great to get people housed. But I do see all the park surveys that we've had, and there's huge participation in the neighborhood. People want to be involved in the decision making of what's going on around them. So, and it's not always easy to find out about these opportunities. You have to be a bit of my type of person to go look online and find these surveys and things like that. But they do post them on the street and you can see that. But there are so many different ways to get involved, and even just open budgeting, there is increasingly governments are trying to get participatory, I can never say the word, budgeting.
It's so hard to say it.
Too many P's in it. But they try and get the public involved in deciding what some of the budget priorities are going to be each year. I know the City of Toronto does it. So there are many different ways. Yes, some of them involve some effort to go find out what they are, but hopefully we can all muster a little bit of that if we can muster doom scrolling all day long.
Exactly.
It's a much more positive use of your scrolling and it'll make you feel better too. But they don't have to be big things. They don't have to be all at once. They can be over the course of quite a bit of time, but just you do feel better when you've contributed to something. And again, I am somebody who's been involved in the political process for a long time. You don't have to get involved with a political party to actually participate in a democracy. Only 1% to 2% of people actually belong to a political party in this country. My partisan friends will hate me saying these things, but like, you don't actually have to go volunteer with them. There's plenty of ways you can get involved without attaching yourself to a partisan stripe. And a lot of what gets done in this country and our democracy is done that way. So I just think it's important to remember that it doesn't have to be overwhelming. It doesn't have to take over your life. It's just something that you can do when you have time. Yeah. So before we wrap up here, I want to talk about the road to the conference, because we'll be dropping this episode about 2 weeks before it happens. So people should still have time to register and get excited about attending. What do you hope that people take away from the conference this year that'll make them feel more hopeful about Canada's future? Because again, that's the point of this podcast, is to talk about how to get more excited about the future.
The thing is, we've talked about some really heavy stuff during this conversation, right? We've talked about authoritarian rules spreading across the world. We've talked about a crisis of insularity. We've talked about, AI guidelines and policy and safety policy falling away. It's really hard to wake up and face that every single day. It really is. Let's be honest. I wake up sometimes being like, oh my God, is ethical AI over? What happens? Who's controlling our future? And the truth of the matter is, that's why I do this work. And that's why I encourage everyone to come to this conference and to be in this community, because there is a really extraordinary group of people across organizations, across sectors, who aren't taking it laying down, if I'm going to be honest. They are fighting and working and thinking out loud, and they're doing it together, and they know they're not going to always get it right, but they're committed to doing it. And so what I hope people will take away is that people still really care deeply about one another. They really care about democracy. And, through the dialogues and all the research I've done across the country, I've seen that even when people really disagree, they still share a desire for fairness, for dignity, and a system that works for everybody. And I think that's the big takeaway, right? This is like a shared commitment to building and rebuilding this foundation that we have in this country. And I think it means, quite frankly, that the divisions that we see and all the heavy stuff we talked about, it's not the end of the story. It's just really powerfully outlining the challenges we can work through together. So I feel hopeful being in the rooms and spaces like this. And I think you will too. I think it's a space where you can talk and listen and understand different perspectives. And quite frankly, voice your own distaste or disagreement with things you're hearing too. People in this room, they want to do that. We want to think through it together. So if people can leave feeling like they had a real conversation, whether it's about the economy, whether it's about constructive disagreement, whether it's about the role that we play in society, or whether it's just really getting to hear Cory Doctorow rant and rave about disenshitification in the most intelligent, hilarious, and serious way, there's something for everybody. And ultimately, this conference, I think, really helps us feel like we're moving in the right direction for Canada's future.
I think that's a great note to end at. And I will say, the other benefit of going to the conference is you get to meet me in Victoria. You can come walk next to us and say hello. So, it's nice because it's a big conference, but it's small enough that you will run into people and can chat with folks. So I'm looking forward to that. I'm looking forward to seeing you there. I think it's going to be great. Yeah. And for those who haven't, again, purchased your ticket yet, you can go online to the website and you can use our code to save 20%, which is always good because it's nice to save money. But until then, hopefully this was, enough to get you excited about the conference, because I know I'm excited. Obviously, Victoria is. And, thanks for joining us today, guys.
Thanks so much, Teresa. What a brilliant conversation.
You've been listening to Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative, a Canadian-owned company specializing in strategic communications, narrative development, and content creation. Our music today was composed by Elliot Middleton. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing to access future episodes the moment they drop. Thanks for listening.